Welcome everyone and thank you for attending today. My name is Minnie Chandramuli and I'm a Senior Associate in the Employment team at Fieldfisher here in London. And we're absolutely delighted to be hosting today's webinar on the 4-day week and to hear from our excellent panellists that we have here today. As you may know, in June 2022, a global campaign took place to pilot a 4-day week. The 6-month pilot completed in the UK in December last year, and the final report was released last month, and it called the pilot a resounding success, with 92% of employers involved in the pilot retaining the 4-day week. We've had about 100 years of 9-to-5 working, but interest in new ways of working has been gathering momentum over the last few years. The pandemic clearly prompted a global shift in mindset around how people work, with different countries responding in different ways. But it has seemed to provide a fertile ground for the 4-day week movement to pivot from perhaps a niche idea to potentially a mainstream concept. But when it comes to the 4-day week, the question on all our minds is, can it actually work? And in particular, can it work for all companies and businesses or only a select few? And equally as important a question, why should we risk trying the 4-day week, a novel approach, rather than sticking to what we already know? Productivity growth has been the key to improvement in living standards over the course of decades. And as we're seeing, our technology is getting stronger, and apps like ChatGPT make some jobs more productive. Could that spark the change we need in our working culture and hours? 2021 gave us the Great Resignation. 2022 gave us the quiet quitting phenomena. Is the 4-day week the solutions to these issues? So on that note, I would like to introduce you to each of our panel members. Before I do so, just a quick note that the session today will be recorded. You will see a question box in the control panel where you can add questions that you may have for the panel members. If we have time at the end, we'll definitely try and answer those questions. But if we don't have time, then we'll try and follow up with you afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel. So first up, we have Jo O'Connor. Jo is the director and co-founder of the Work Time Reduction Centre of Excellence based in Toronto, Canada. The centre looks to change the world of work through shorter hours and smarter working. Prior to this, Jo was the CEO of 4-day Week Global, where he coordinated pilots of the 4-day working week in Ireland, the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. He also conducted a 1-year research fellowship at Cornell University's Industrial Labour and Relations School, leading a research project on working time reduction. So we clearly have an expert on our hands. Welcome, Jo. Next, we have Emily Hatton. Emily is the head of operations at Webtopia, a bespoke digital advertising agency. She has experience across a wide range of industries and credits her background as a business analyst for giving her a unique insight into internal processes and identifying areas for improvement. Emily is a member of the expert advisory group for the Work Time Reduction Centre of Excellence that Jo leads. She's based in Malta and was at the forefront of implementing the 4-day working week at Webtopia. Next, we have Charmaine Clavier St. John. Charmaine is the head of people at Hutch, a London-based mobile game developer and publisher. Hutch's games have been played by over 300 million people. She was appointed as the head of people at Hutch in January 2021 and has over 20 years experience across a variety of companies in the advertising and media space. She was named as the iList industry winner for her achievements in diversity and inclusion. And in 2019, she completed a leadership program at Harvard Business School. She was the key driver in piloting the 4-day week at Hutch. And Hutch recently made the 4-day week their rolling policy for 12 months. And finally, we have our very own Nick Thorpe. Nick is a partner in Fieldfisher's employment team in London. He has more than 20 years experience advising private, family-owned, listed businesses and international corporates, and has a wealth of experience in all aspects of employment law, and has taught me nearly everything I know in English employment law. So welcome to our panelists, and thank you so much for joining us today. I know everyone's very interested in this topic, so I'm just going to go straight into it. If we could start with you, Jo, perhaps just back to basics. Could you explain the basic premise of the 4-day week pilot and how it worked?
Sure. So I had been researching and involved in work time reduction since about 2018, but would be the first person to say that back then it was quite a philosophical discussion. There was a very small number of companies that was actually doing this. And it was only really in the early part of 2021, midway through the pandemic, that this really started to take off as an idea that more and more leaders and organizations were becoming attracted to. So I designed the first ever pilot program and research project in Ireland, which was intended really to be a small scale de-risking process for maybe 12 to 15 companies who are interested in testing this out to provide some support, some infrastructure and some research assessment. Obviously then as the year went on and the interest grew, as part of 4-day week global, we then expanded that model to a number of different countries, as you've mentioned, including the UK, where the largest trial took part. And effectively what we had was a 6-month coordinated trial with a 2 to 3 month planning and preparation phase in advance of that, which consisted of workshops, mentoring support, networking between the organizations that were taking part and other businesses that had already adopted this, and then research by Boston College, Cambridge University, and Autonomy to look at the impact of the shorter work week, both on the participating businesses and on their people.
And so could you explain to us, Jo, what does the 4-day week actually mean? Does it mean we compress our hours in 4 days? Are you doing a job sharing arrangement? What does it mean?
So when we talk about the trials and when we talk about the work that I do at the Work Time Reduction Center of Excellence, we're talking about genuine work time reduction. So it was a necessity. It wasn't necessary for companies to reduce their hours by 20%, but it was necessary that there was some form of a genuine reduction in work time in order to participate in the program. And I guess the reason behind that is, if you look at, compressed hour models, so effectively taking the same number of hours and compressing that into fewer days worldwide, I've seen some examples of that working relatively well, particularly in industries like manufacturing or hospitality, where being available and present is a large part of the value creation in those roles. But I think certainly when we're talking about knowledge work, the idea that somebody would be, as productive or more productive in their 9th or 10th hour on a Wednesday as they would be on their 1st or 2nd hour on a Friday, I think that the jury is definitely out on that. And equally, the research is very mixed as to whether it would have positive well-being impacts or positive burnout impacts where people are working for 9, 10-hour days, so much longer days. So really the shorter work week or the 4-day week, as we define it, is about how can you produce the same output, how can you produce the same results in less time, so with fewer or with more efficient inputs.
Okay, and what were the initial research findings that prompted the idea to pilot this program globally?
Well, I think there was a number of business examples worldwide, including Perpetual Guardian and Unilever in Australasia. There was a major study done in Iceland, also some smaller studies done in other parts of Scandinavia like Denmark. And overall, the academic literature would suggest that there was, certainly not a close correlation between hours worked and productivity, but there was quite a close correlation between, reduced hours and improved well-being outcomes. So, that was the background to the research. And I think if you look at the UK trial and you look at the trials that have taken place to date, the results are very clear in terms of saying that the companies that have done this, their employees are happier, their employees are healthier. These companies are better positioned when it comes to attracting and retaining talent. And actually, and we can, I'm sure, get into this in the discussion, these companies have found ways to become more efficient and more productive in less time.
Okay, and in terms of the organisations that did get involved in the pilot, did your research suggest that this would only work for certain types of organisations, or could it work across the board? And the reason I asked this question up front is because obviously there's been headlines recently around, you know, this way of working is never going to work for the NHS or our teachers. And in fact, you know, coming from a law firm where I work on billable hours, it does seem a bit far-fetched perhaps that it could work for these types of organisations. And what did your research show on that front?
So there was a diversity of companies that participated in the research and in the trials. Certainly the volume effect in terms of the demand and the trend behind this has come from sectors like technology, finance, ICT, software, and so on. But there isn't an industry in the world that I couldn't point you to a successful case study or example where they've managed to make a shorter work week work. But again, I think definition is important here. Nobody is arguing that I'm aware that absolutely everybody would move to a 4-day 9-to-5. What I would argue is that there's not many professions and roles and industries across the economy today that work a 5-day 9-to-5 that couldn't find a way to move to a 4-day. And I think outside of that, where you're talking about sectors that rely heavily on shifts, sectors that already work, you know, irregular work patterns, so not the kind of standard 5-day 9-to-5, we're talking about a different version or a different variation of work time reduction that would need to be applied in those settings. When it comes to the legal services industry and professional services more generally, we have seen examples of law firms who've successfully moved to shorter work weeks, either by changing their model of billing, so moving partly or wholly to value-based, fixed fee or project-based billing. But we've also seen law firms that have moved to shorter work weeks and haven't changed their billing structure. They've just done it because they've managed to find sufficient efficiencies in their non-billable time. They've managed to reduce their overheads and streamline their operations in terms of their work, which isn't directly interfacing with clients, in order to be able to sustain their billable hours at a requisite level. So my argument would be that with the right imagination and with the right commitment to change, that this can be made happen in pretty much every industry all over the world.
So I guess it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We're not saying everyone has to go to this model. It's working out what could work for your business model.
Absolutely. And I think if you look, you know, this is not something which isn't, you know, just not one size fits all across different industries or different companies. When you're talking about larger organizations, sometimes it's not even one size fits all within that business. So we've seen companies who have moved to a shorter work week where for one department, it might be a universal day off because they're maximizing collaboration time and coordination within that team. And for other parts of the business, it might require different rosters and schedules to make sure that they can sustain coverage through a 5-day week, and in some cases, even a 6 or a 7-day week. So certainly, we're not talking about a one-size-fits-all here, but the key point to make is, you know, the reason why companies have succeeded with this, it feels counterintuitive for people. How can you produce the same outcomes, or even in some cases better outcomes, in less time? And they've done it for two reasons. They've done it because, number one, the 4-day week is not just about changing the hours people work, it's also about fundamentally changing the way that people work and using this as a forcing function to change the way your business operates, to change work practices. And then there's also the incentive effect. This is something that is so transformative for people, so life-changing for people, that if this is really, if the success of this is closely linked and conditional to very clear business objectives, very clear performance targets, you create this positive tension in your business where people are really focused and really motivated to meet those goals in order to be able to make the 4-day week sustainable in the long run for them and for the business.
Okay, and I mean, I guess that's a good point to turn to Charmaine and Emily, who have piloted the program and are currently have a 4-day week. Perhaps just to start though, maybe Charmaine, could you just tell us a bit about the business you work in, the type of people employed, the culture, just to set the context, and I'll ask the same from you, Emily, as well.
Sure. So as you mentioned earlier, we are a mobile game developer. So we make racing car games, free-to-play games for mobile phones. And there's about 160 of us, mainly based in London, but we also have a small office in Canada and also in Dundee too. And we employ a range of people from, of course, more on the techie side, the engineers, the creative artists, as well as the commercial team as well. I'd like to think, well, we certainly really talk about our culture of being one that is a people first culture. When setting up Hutch 11 years ago, the founders had also come from very big gaming companies where there was a bit of a culture of what we call crunch culture. And that was really about working extremely excessive hours. You know, there was this horror stories I've heard of, you know, how many divorces there were that year, you know, 7 days a week, God knows how many hours in the evening. And so when they set up the company, there was very much a focus on not being that type of gaming company and a big focus on well-being. And I think that's also what, you know, which motivated us to move to a 4-day week too.
Okay, and Emily, perhaps you could touch on what it's like at Webtopia and what was the motivator for your company to try the 4-day week.
Yeah, sure. So we're a digital marketing agency. So we're a team of 25, but we're growing quite rapidly all the time. So very similar to Charmaine, actually, in terms of the drivers for our culture. So we're very people first as well. And it was from a similar instance. So marketing is traditionally very work in the evenings, work all weekends, and the model of people being expected to work a lot of overtime, and our founder was very anti that, and we really wanted to make sure that our team had a great work-life balance, and that's what we were very well known for as an agency, and that people would want to come and work for us in that respect. So we have a globally remote team, so they're based all over the world. We're very pro women and mothers returning after having children to work, so we try and make sure our practices support that, which is why we have flexible working and a remote team. But that led us to exploring the reduced time working option and putting in place the 4-day week. So we were actually looking ahead of the trial at looking at reducing the working hours and seeing how we could do that, and then the trial was advertised and we decided that it was great timing and it was a great option for us to take part in.
And I mean, what I'm hearing from both of you, it sounds like there was support from the top, but, you know, were there skeptics in the organisation where you had to have difficult conversations to get them on board, or, you know, were there people who wanted to keep the status quo when you were sort of exploring this idea?
They're absolutely absolutely for us. I mean, I think sometimes there's maybe it's a bit paranoid, but I think sometimes there's a bit of a perception that, you know, the companies that had taken part in the trial are, you know, a bit hippie-ish, and, you know, it's easier to do, and, you know, we're still a business and there were genuine fears. We have a parent company in Sweden that we have to report to. You know, our CFO, for example, and other members of the leadership team were, you know, understandably cautious. Not least because, you know, we also, what if it failed? How do you come back from you know, being able to do a trial and then say, I'm really sorry, but we've got to come back. Some of our managers were concerned and already, you know, worked longer days, you know, to get things done. I thought it's never going to work. So we did a massive piece in terms of bringing the line managers in confidentially at first before announcing to the wider company. Various, you know, open conversations with the leadership team about whether or not we thought the trial was right for us. But after doing lots of research, you know, reading the reports, seeing how productivity could be maintained, if not improved, the benefits to wellbeing, turnover, recruitment, all of those things, and speaking to other companies, we netted out that it was worth a try, and that we would just be really clear on the fact that it was a trial and what was expected right from the outset.
And Emily, did you have to have sort of difficult conversations as well, and how did you approach those? Yes,
so we had nervousness, I think. So I presented the idea initially and the CEO was very bought into it, which is great. But actually the wider members of the leadership team were more nervous because they are heads of the delivery departments, and they felt a lot more nervous about how it would affect the team and how it would affect the delivery. Also, we had a lot of nerves about how the clients would take it, because it's widely known that marketing clients can be quite demanding. So how we would manage their expectations was something we were nervous about as well. Kind of luckily for us, but we work with clients that are of the same ethos as us. So we're picky about the kind of clients we work with. So we did think that most of them would be understanding and would support such a movement from us, but we did have to do a lot of thinking and planning out comms in terms of how we were going to manage it, at what time, how we were going to tell them, so it's not optional, we're doing this, and how we would get them to buy into it and ensure that they could give us feedback as well. So there was nervousness from managers and regarding clients' feedback as well.
And in terms of that planning process, I think, you know, one question that keeps hopping up in my mind is, how do you manage people who work different, already have a different working arrangement? You know, we know how it would look for a full-time employee, but how is it going to work for a part-time employee? And how do you deal with things like holiday? Was there discussion about that? And did you have to speak to those employees individually in terms of different working arrangements? Charmaine was...
Yeah, we did. I mean, the holiday issue was a big one, actually. I know that some companies in the trial maintained their existing holiday. We decided to prorate our hours, and partly one of the reasons for that was, you know, feedback from the managers saying, look, we're going to be going into a trial, adjusting to a 4-day week. If we kept holiday the same, there might be impact on the team in terms of, you know, lack of resource. So we made the decision to prorate a holiday. Not everyone, you know, there were some queries. Now, I've been 4 days a week for a while. I've got 2 children, and so for me it was a no-brainer. It was like, you know, it's not, you're not losing holiday, it's the equivalent of working a 5-day week. But there was some comms that we had to do around it to really kind of reassure everyone that it was just the equivalent and it would be the right thing to do during the trial. So we got around that really by looking at what was the upside, you know. So yes, you know, your holiday was adjusted, not lost. But, you know, during the trial, you were benefiting from 26 days of Fridays, which is the equivalent of an extra 5.5 weeks of pay, or so, you know, of additional holiday. On the existing part-timers, we did equalise their pay. Mm-hmm. There was obviously lots of discussion around that. Now, I know that other companies might do things differently. I've heard of other companies perhaps giving additional annual leave, or prorating even further. So if you're a 4-day week, you might go to a 3.5-day week or something. So there were different options around that, but we decided to equalise pay. So it was the equivalent of 100% of pay, in the same way that it was for the full-time staff.
And was that similar for you at Webtopia, Emily?
Kind of. So we applied the 20% rule on everything, really. So for part-timers, we had the discussion about whether A, they wanted to, and B, it would work business-wise to reduce their hours by 20%. If not, then we would increase their pay by 20%, which is the equivalent of what all full-timers were kind of getting in terms of a benefit. And with holiday, we did the same as Charmaine. So, but it was prorated for the part-time staff, so it was 20% on top of what they would be getting anyway as a part-timer.
Okay, and Nick, perhaps now's a good time to come to you. When implementing, we've sort of talked about some of the issues around different working arrangements and holiday. So when implementing this type of arrangement, even on a trial basis, what would be the key legal considerations for a 4-day week policy or contractual change?
Okay, thanks, Minnie. As you know, we were very lucky to work with a number of organisations that are part of the pilot. So, but there are various legal considerations, some of which we've just touched on. But I think the first point I'd make is that the introduction of the 4-day week doesn't necessarily require changes to employee terms and conditions, particularly if you're going to just test the water with a pilot or a trial. You know, their existing terms will remain the default. And I think that certainly for HR teams, there's always that concern of doing a full, you know, contract rollout program, and that might put some people off actually entertaining the idea of change and a 4-day week. I think that in the same way that businesses have introduced, say, hybrid working policies that sort of overlay existing terms, you can introduce policies that for the 4-day week that sets out clearly the arrangements and the expectations, and if you have to enforce them, then treat them as reasonable instructions. So I don't think you have to sort of over lawyer or over paper this, particularly if it cuts against the sort of the spirit of what you're you're trying to do. But there are other considerations. I mean, if you think in certain businesses, particularly those that have sort of very established and hard fought over, say, overtime arrangements, and just making sure that you take a look at those and that they dovetail well with your new 4-day working arrangements, so everyone's clear, you know, when the trigger is for those additional enhanced rates. Another is around, say, bonus and incentive arrangements. You touched at the start, say, on law firms, and if you look at, regardless of the modelling, whether it's charged on an hourly rate or a value-based rate or fixed fee rate, behind that, a lot of lawyers, when it comes to their incentive arrangements, will have performance metrics that are based on chargeable or billable hours. And so that's something you need to perhaps look at, particularly if you're going to introduce the arrangement partway through a bonus year, to ensure that people still got that sort of earning potential or opportunity. And you know, it will maybe need a shift in behaviours for those that look to you know, maximise that bonus potential. And then there's the other knotty issues which talked about, Charmaine mentioned, around holiday, and there's various ways that could be dealt with, particularly if you're keeping people contracted on the 5-day a week but working 4 days. They'll have the 5-day entitlement, but you may look at it as being sort of elected entitlement as a non-elective entitlement, and the non-elective falling on those non-working days, but that's sort of going into a bit more of the weeds there. But so I think there are various ways. And then the big one, which is not to forget your part-time or atypical workforce, and making sure that they're not less favourably treated. And as Emily and both Charmaine mentioned, there's various ways, and indeed various ways that employers did that in the pilot, to make sure that they were treated fairly as part of that arrangement. So I think, yeah, a number of considerations, but no blockers, certainly no blockers, and no hurdles that would be insurmountable from a legal perspective.
Thanks, Nick. And I guess just one other consideration, what we've considered when we've been, you know, rolling out policies, is what do you have to think about if you have a workforce which perhaps has a disability or childcare arrangements, and the proposed working times might not be appropriate for them, and how do you deal with that in terms of a policy that you're rolling out?
Yeah, I think a 4-day week policy is no different to any other new policy you're intended to work out. That initially you need to look and think, does this have any unintended consequences? You know, is it going to have an adverse effect on any particular group? So I think that's the same process you adopt to any new policy. I think also what's true is sort of encourage or discourage the sort of the blanket policy without you building in enough flexibility to take into account individual circumstance. So and you mentioned various perhaps scenarios, but I mean, one of the things that came out of the report is a real positive impact it had on employee well-being. But there may be some people that, whether it be through their condition or otherwise, may struggle if we're looking at them producing the same, sort of being as productive or more productive in that reduced times. And so being sensitized to that and building that flexibility in the policy, I think, is important. Similarly, and you already touched on it with the one-size-fits-all or adapting the model for individual circumstance. If people have got childcare or caring responsibilities, you know, the set 1 day off might not be the solution for them to reap, you know, the benefits of the 4-day week. So I think it's ensuring that and particularly if you're having to scale up and you're talking about a large number of employees, still being sensitized to some of those individual circumstances within the policy.
Great. And Joe, I might come to you. We've obviously touched on having different models for different parts of the business. And one thing in the report was that some businesses made meeting certain KPIs conditional on, you know, continuing the 4-day week. And a question I had was around, you know, what if there's some employees who are exceptional and they can meet all their KPIs in 4 days, but there's other employees who aren't able to, and that means they have to keep working 5 days. Do you have any, you know, thoughts on how that might impact culture if you have some people doing 4 days because they're able to meet their KPIs and some doing 5 because they can't? Sorry, I think you're on mute, Joe.
Of course, has to happen on every webinar, doesn't it? At least. I think what's critical here and what we would advise companies is individual measurement will tend to lead to individual action. Collective measurement will lead to collective action. And therefore, we would very much advise that when you're talking about this at a team level, at a department level, this is about, collective KPIs and people having a collective responsibility to meet them. We would never argue, if there could be 5, 6, 7% of efficiency to be found in individual change, like, for example, people feeling better rested or more energized at work as a result of this policy. We have seen some data that suggests social media browsing goes down. People are less likely to do life administration tasks during their work week because they have a scheduled day off. But I don't think anyone would argue that that is accountable for 20–25% of efficiency and productivity gains. The key thing here are the structural changes, things like changing the way you do meetings, the way you manage distraction, the way you implement different processes in the business, the way you use technology. These are not things that any one person has the agency to change. And so as a result, we would very much advise measurement should be collective. And I think in terms of, in every business, you will have a certain cross-section of people for whom this policy just won't suit, particularly when you're talking about bigger businesses. And I think we would very much advise, don't take an a la carte approach to the trial. I think it's very important that everyone participates in the experiment, because if you have a situation where you have a team of 10, 7 are in, 3 are out, it's difficult to get that kind of collective approach. But we've seen lots of businesses very successfully make the commitment that if at the end of the trial, we decide that we're going to make this policy permanent, or we're going to continue with the policy because it works for the majority of people and it works for the business, they offer an opt-out where effectively if people want to go back to working 5 days to produce the same output, that is something that can be facilitated. So that kind of flexible approach tends to work well. I think what Nick talked about in terms of the contract versus policy pieces, there's a management benefit to that too, which is, we've seen companies who have this in place as a conditional opt-in policy for years now, going back to 2018, 2019, they've never changed from the 5-day contract. And what that does is not only does it avoid some of the unintended consequences contractually, it also really embeds that this is not something like your entitlement to mandatory sick leave or annual leave. This is something that is very much, based around committing to, continuous improvement. And I think it helps with the fear that some businesses have that you'll have this kind of Hawthorne effect where, some people, you'll get the productivity gains during the trial because people are being measured. Although, I would say if the only time people are measuring performance and productivity is when they're trialing the 4-day week, that's another problem. But, I think it does help to really embed this as this is something that requires a kind of an ongoing commitment. This is an ongoing fitness rather than a one-off change.
And you've touched on productivity. Emily, how did your business actually measure productivity when you compare? Because I think one sort of, not roadblock, but thinking is how are we going to work out if this is actually working for our business? So how was productivity measured versus 5 days and 4 days?
Okay, so we work with clients and we have kind of a set amount of hours that we would expect the team to do per client, for example, a week. So we have quite a detailed look at productivity anyway and ways of measuring it. What we did as part of the preparation for the trial was to look at what parts of what the team do really add value versus what don't. So like highlighting the things that add value and doing some work on removing the things that we felt like actually could be removed from the service and what the team were doing. And like Joe mentioned before, like a lot of internal time, we were really questioning about the efficiency of what we were doing there. And what we could see quite clearly is that by making some recommendations with the team, working with all the team members about what they recommended they could remove and where they could find efficiency, and then trialing that like as part of the trial to see whether that was true, where else we could find efficiency, and then because we use task management systems to record all tasks and record all time, we can really easily measure whether that's working or not.
And Charmaine, I know it's quite a different business. How did you measure productivity?
Yeah, so we it was a challenge, and we ended up slimming down the number of measurements. So there's, as I say, there's 160 of us at Hutch. We originally asked every single team to come up with measurements that they felt comfortable with, so it didn't feel like a top-down targets over everyone's heads type of approach. And the teams were all gunning to get going and came back with way too many. So we slimmed those down and ended up slimming them down again. So halfway through the trial, you know, we decided to measure bi-monthly from all of the teams, and halfway through, even though they should have been quite easy to measure, we found that people were struggling, and things that, you know, that we thought would be relatively easy, that were you know, even things like our office service team, for example, they use a system called Trello, and they track all of their tasks in Trello. It's like, oh, we do that already, we can just continue tracking that. When it came to crunch time and the bi-monthly measurements, I would hear the teams, you know, saying things like, but I've had 10 people come up to my desk asking for a swipe card. You know, I didn't have time to log that, but it's still taken time out of my day. And, you know, to laboriously log every single thing was. So in the end, we had a meeting with our mentor as part of the trial and said, look, we're just a bit worried. Are we doing this right? Are we doing too many? And he was quite reassuring and said, look, you know, some companies just measure one or two things, like don't overthink it, right? So we scaled everything back, and the prime thing really that we measure now, we continue to measure, as well as things, of course, like well-being, turnover, you know, hiring, recruitment. We measure sprint velocity. So we use a system called Agile, and we work in 2-week sprint cycles. And it can be complicated to get your head around, but if you don't use it already, the easiest way to think about it is all of our games teams work on a 2-week project cycle, and we assign points to the work that they produce. So for example, some teams might work on the basis where the size of a task might have different, will have different points. If you work on a small task, it could be 2 points. If you work on a larger task, that could be 8 points assigned to that task. In other teams, it works with the number of days it takes to complete a piece of work. But essentially, the concept is the same. It's how many points are being created and being used in a sprint cycle. We already measured that anyway pre the trial, so it made sense to continue measuring that, and we are still doing that now. We've decided to go to quarterly, and they are being shared back with the team, so everyone's aware of how we're tracking in terms of the sprint velocity.
And so you've obviously seen the productivities remain same or better.
Yes, we have. The trial. Yeah, we have.
Okay, and I guess while we're on sort of productivity, Nick, just when you have to manage, you know, if during the trial you are perhaps setting a higher target for productivity, you want people to be focused, and you have employees who are not perhaps performing at the productivity level you require to maintain the 4-day week. Just some thoughts on how you would manage them from an employment perspective.
Oh, okay. I mean, Charmaine and Emily will be close to this, but I haven't actually seen those concerns really materialise, and it's possibly just in terms of the ethos and having that collective and that commitment to making this work. But I think the key question is, are your performance expectations going to be higher because you're expecting that sort of same output in 4 days? So I think in any rollout, you're going to have to be clear what those expectations are, sort of setting that baseline, and including if there's going to be any adjustment to the role because of the reduced working week. So that's absolutely important if you're going to then think about how you're going to manage people fairly if you've got this change in expectation. I suppose the only other dimension then that this really adds is particularly in the more traditional performance management model, where you're looking perhaps at putting in performance improvement plans or otherwise, is actually giving some thought to whether an alternative would be to revert to the 5-day week if that is at the core, you know, the cause of the underlying cause for this individual struggling in terms of meeting the outputs that you expect. So I think that's the added dimension, is to think of that as a potential alternative. But otherwise, it's the usual principles that we'll be familiar with in terms of manage some people fairly, which is making sure they're very clear on the expectation, you know, that's a realistic expectation, and that we set them realistic, you know, goals and objectives if we're then going to have to manage them against that. So if we're shifting the dial, just let's make sure everyone's clear what those expectations are.
Great, thank you. And I guess one question is, you know, were employees or are employees required to sometimes work on their day off? Is that sort of part and parcel of how this works? Sometimes you need to, but you know, most of the time you don't, or how's that sort of played out in practice?
So we have a really busy Q4. That's our busiest quarter, and particularly 2 weeks around Black Friday is our crucial time. And yes, we did expect team members to work an extra day if they required it. So we very much trust our team members to let us know what work they need to do and when they need to do it. As Nick mentioned earlier, it was what we learned through that experience was we would normally offer to pay some overtime if people worked over their hours, because we very much don't expect people to do overtime as part of the norm. And if they are required to, because there's a business demand, we always want to make sure that they're compensated for it, either with leave or with pay. And we had to make, what we didn't do in this period, which we know we need to going forward, was to make that clear, was that the 5th day was not paid, because that is a benefit, but any time above that 5th day would be paid. And we didn't make that clear before this period, and that was very much a learning for us that we would need to do that.
Okay, and in terms of Charmaine, one thing is we talked about part-time employees, but how did you deal with, obviously one of the big gains of this is well-being, but some of the queries we were seeing for companies that had piloted was you'd have some employees who were saying, great, I'm getting my 5 days pay and 4 day, my 5th day I'm going to go work another job so I can get, you know, make more money, and perhaps that wouldn't lead to the same well-being gains. Did you have that experience at all, and how did you manage that?
We did. It's a really good question, because it did come up at the, you know, as a leadership team right at the beginning. We were like, what would we do? What would we say? And what we found was that only one person had asked, and we just treated it as though we would in a normal situation, right? So in everyone's contracts, there is this, you know, we'd go through the same process. Is there a conflict? You know, is it going to impact our work, for Hutch's work? So we had one member of staff that wanted to work at a barista. She's really interested in that type of thing. You know, there's no conflict, the type of work we do. We made it clear that if everyone needed to stop the trial or come back 5 days, and you know, that perhaps would be her priority. So that's how we dealt with that. But largely, I think people just really benefit having that day off, to, you know, to really recharge and to, you know, do whatever hobby or thing they like to do. So it hasn't been the majority at all. It's just, as I say, very, very well, it's just one person out of 160 so far.
Okay, and so if we move to, I guess we've sort of been talking about implementing the pilot, and if we move sort of to the takeaways and successes, I guess my first question for you, Jo, is we've talked a lot about the well-being, put the positive well-being impact and perhaps on reduced attrition. But if we're talking to our clients and people in HR, they're really thinking about the bottom line and making sure the financials aren't impacted by this. So could you sort of talk to what the story has been with the pilot and how it's impacted financials?
Sure. So what we've seen in the UK trial, and this is again in line with very similar outcomes and results from previous trials that have taken place, is that revenue has remained either stable. So if you look at the UK trial, I think it was a very marginal increase end of trial versus start of trial for the companies that are participating. If you compare it back against, you know, the same period for the previous year, it was actually quite a significant increase. So I think the story is that the kinds of companies that are implementing this are companies that are successful, companies that are growing. And I think the types of organizations tend to be ones that, you know, already have strong cultures and that are using the shorter work week really to, you know, to build upon that and to, you know, to be proactive and to show leadership in terms of their sector. I'd like to, if I could very quickly, just come in on the point that Emily made, because this is one of, I would say, the top 2 or 3 misconceptions about the 4-day week is this idea that it's this super rigid structure that as soon as you move to the 4-day week, all other flexibility goes out the window. If you know, it is effectively around treating the scheduled day off like you currently treat a weekend or an evening. And we know that in most modern organizations, there is a need, if there's an emergency, if there's a deadline, if there's a project that requires flexibility, that little bit of leeway. So this is about moving the needle on the standard expectation rather than eliminating flexibility. Mark Mullen, the CEO of Atom Bank, put it really well on a webinar last year when he said, you know, if I get a call from my bank regulator to say, I'm in town on a Friday, could you meet for a coffee? You know, I'm going to treat that the same way as I would have done if he asked me the same thing on a Saturday when I was working a 5-day week. I'm going to take that meeting. But if I'm sending an email to my team who are all off on a Friday that could wait till Monday, well, then that's not a 4-day week behavior. So if you look at the companies that were in the trial, most of them, their average work time was higher than their contracted. If people were contracted 40 hours, typically their real hours was a little bit higher than that. When they moved to the 4-day week, if they moved to 32 or they moved to 34, generally people were working a little bit more than that, but there was a downward pressure on hours. One company example, Inventive in Australia, who implemented this, they call it the gift of the fifth, and they estimate that about 75% of the time people get that day off without requiring to work. 1 in 4, they need to do something. Could be for an hour, could be for 90 minutes. The point here is about moving the needle on the standard expectation.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. And in terms of what has come out of the UK pilot, was there anything in there, Joe, that you found surprising, or did you see that report and think that's exactly what I predicted would happen?
I think the thing that took us by surprise the most, just because it wasn't one of the kind of key areas that we identified at the start of the research, but it was included by the research team, was sleep, and the very significant impact in terms of, you know, sleep deprivation from trial participants. And certainly in the US, one went down from 50% to 17%. That's estimated as having less than 7 hours sleep on average a night. People were sleeping on average about an hour more per night. So that's an interesting finding in itself, but it would also suggest that there's lots of positive knock-on consequences from that in terms of people being refreshed and being focused while they're at work. You know, generally very positive well-being outcomes and lower stress are related to a good night's sleep. So that was one that maybe we weren't watching as closely before the findings came out, but was really a very positive consequence that came out of the trials.
Absolutely. And so, Charmaine, what would you say have been the key benefits that have come out of the trial, or the ongoing 4-day week, and what are the ongoing challenges that you're dealing with?
I think well-being, without question. You know, you hear the stories time and time again, and how rested people feel. You know how, I mean, some of the stories just incredibly heartwarming, the impact it's had on mental health. I think also in terms of the challenges, I'd say, you know, the measuring, we had to refine that a little bit to get the information we needed. You know, things like, you know, at one point we were looking at sickness, and COVID kept messing up the blooming numbers. So that, you know, that was something that we couldn't rely on as much. So getting that right, but also not overthinking it. In terms of challenges, I think that's a strong word. I think what we've made really clear is that we are still learning, right? Even throughout the trial, we had to be willing to flex and adjust. And, you know, I'm thinking now, halfway through the 6-month trial, we added a 2-hour deep work time. There's no meetings, and that was 3 months in. And even now, we are still learning. Meetings was something that came up continuously at the start. So we did things like an entire meeting audit across the entire company. So every team was asked to look at exactly what meetings happened, when, who attended, the frequency, the purpose, and where they could be changed. So things like that. We implemented a quiet hour, deep work time, as I said, a quiet zone where you can go and get your head down in the company. But we're still learning, and we make that clear. And, you know, even though we've said we're keeping this going, if we need to make changes into the next annual year or even later this year, we will. We might make some changes in terms of our new joiners. So currently new joiners don't have to work on the Friday, but there's been some element of them actually having benefits of working on the 5th day, even if it's doing things like mandatory training, you know, to protect the 4 days that we're in. Social time, people mentioned at the end that they felt that, you know, we could be better around things like that. So we've implemented different things as we've continued this year, like bi-monthly team days. So we actually do come in every 2 months on a Friday as an entire company, again, to protect the 4 days that we're in, but that allows some social time, the company all hands, business updates, game updates from our CEO, as well as things like workshops. So that we just had our first team day a couple of weeks ago, and that allowed us to do workshops on how could we be even more productive, what are we missing in terms of being efficient in a 4-day week. So we're still learning, and, you know, when those challenges appear, looking at what we can do to be better and to keep improving.
Okay, and Emily, does that ring true for Webtopia as well, or what have been the key learnings and ongoing learnings?
So I think the benefits were, again, well-being, obviously, across the team. The team really appreciate the benefit, and I think that it keeps them really engaged with us as an employer, that obviously that we offer that, but also it attracts new talent to us as well. So marketing is a very competitive industry for getting candidates, and having that as a perk that we can offer is massive in terms of what we can do that isn't just monetary, because money, as we know, isn't the only thing candidates are looking for now. They're really focused on work-life balance as well. So the fact that we can offer flexible working plus remote is great for our candidates. And in terms of learning, so I'd say some challenges are that we do still get quite a lot of reports of stress from the team, particularly in busy periods. And I think it's exactly as Joe said, that actually there is some stress in thinking that you have to do everything in 4 days. And sometimes just to take the stress off, we just say, if you can, just do something on your day off. Like, we don't want it to become the norm, but if you've got 6 hours off rather than 8 hours off, that's still better than where we were before the trial. So you might just have to make some exceptions, that sometimes it's a bit of busy time, and if you would feel better because you feel a bit overloaded to work a bit extra or work a bit later one night, do it. Like, we just want it to be really output focused rather than really focused on this 32 hours or 4 days a week. That is kind of an ongoing challenge, that actually it creates a different level that you have to be focused on that, but the ethos is just meant to be reducing your work time ideally to around 32 hours. But again, as you would in a 5-day week, you might occasionally have to do overtime, and that is also fine. And that's a challenge. And I think a surprising thing was that the client feedback was fine. So we had really preempted some negative feedback from the clients, and there was a couple of clients that did say something. And I think the problem is, when you do get any issues with the client, they will try and attribute it to that change that you have made, and I think that is kind of a challenge, but proportion wise it was totally manageable, and yeah, not a blocker at all.
And it was implemented globally at Webtopia. I know you said you're fully remote, Emily. Did you face any specific challenges with, like, the cultural and legal landscape across different countries, or was that not much of an issue?
No, not really. I mean, the same as culturally, it didn't really make any difference, because it's just the way that our workforce is, and I think they are used to working for UK or US based organisations where it's organised. So no, not for us, no challenges.
Okay, and we've sort of already touched on this, but Nick, just if a company did start the trial and then they decided at the end of it they didn't want to continue with it, how would they, you know, withdraw that practice, just from a legal perspective, so you're not creating ongoing obligations for employees to keep this benefit?
Okay, maybe just start by pointing out the report that actually there's only a very small percentage of employers who are no longer continuing the trial. So it was seen as a success for a very large percentage of the employers. So that's, I think, the context in which we'll make these comments. I think legally, I mean, if you're setting out as a trial and saying, look, if the trial doesn't work, then we'll revert to our existing working practices, then you know, from a contractual perspective, that's fine. But from, you know, an ER or employee relations perspective, you're going to have pretty good reasons to explain. So something, you know, your measure, we talked about the KPIs or the measurements that you use during the process. and being able to explain and give cogent, compelling reasons as to why that hasn't worked, and you are reverting to your previous arrangements. I mean, one other point, this is collective, and what I like about it. You know, Millie, you all know that within Vision and our team, we have a lot of atypical arrangement, but they're sort of tailored around an individual from the top down. You know, this is collective. But of course, if you've tried that, it doesn't work at a collective level. That doesn't stop individuals saying, well, look, that worked for me. And then you'll be in, certainly from a UK perspective, a statutory framework that says, okay, then you need to give reasons as to why you would refuse or reject that form of flexible working request. So it is important, I think, when you go into this process, investing in this process, that you do buy in, are committed, and that if there is concern, that you've got good evidence to support why it's no longer going to work, and you're going to revert to your existing panel of the current status quo.
Great, thanks, Nick. And so if I can just come to you as the expert on working time and just on the future of work, what are your thoughts on where the trends are? And perhaps I think there might be an upcoming another pilot. Could you talk to us about what's upcoming and what you see as the trends moving forward?
Well, one of the things that we've definitely noticed is there are a lot of leaders from very big businesses, particularly in the UK, who probably 3 or 4 months ago, you know, were very non-committal on this. We're watching this, we're interested in it, we're observing it, but that's all. We're now getting a much more defined response. They're either saying, yes, we want to talk about this, we want to explore it, or they're saying, no, it's not for us, and here's why. So I think actually what we're seeing is for a lot of these bigger companies, this is now the #1 thing that people are bringing up on town hall meetings. So they feel they have to have an answer. Regardless of what that answer is, they feel they have to have a position on this. I think it's inevitable we're going to see this grow over the next 5 to 10 years. I think the question is to what extent and how quickly. You know, if you look here in Canada, we had a survey of senior managers that was done by Robert Half, the recruitment agency, who said that 91% thought that the 4-day week in some form, be it reduced or compressed, was going to come in their business in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, out of that 91%, how many of them do you think are either actively doing this now or actively planning for this? I would say it is a microcosm of that. So the opportunity lies in that difference, and it lies in, you know, if people believe this is coming, which I think many do, are you going to be a proactive pioneer and show leadership on it, or are you going to be a passive passenger and take action when your competitors have done it first?
I think that's a great point to end on, but I'll ask Emily and Charmaine if they have any sort of concluding thoughts or maybe just tips or advice for companies that are thinking about implementing this in some way, shape or form.
So I think just to highlight what Charmaine says is, like, really don't overthink it. You learn a lot through the trial, and as much as you can try to prepare before the trial, you don't know it all until you actually put it in place, and then you resolve the issues that you're finding as you come along, and they're kind of minimal, and they're things that you should be looking at as a business anyway. So things to do with productivity and improving that's what all businesses should be striving to achieve. So I think for us it was a no-brainer, and I would really recommend it to any business to explore it and how it can work.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, something I forgot to mention, but, you know, recruitment went up, our turnover went down, as well as, you know, the impact on wellbeing. Productivity remained stable. I'd give it a go. You are going to learn a lot from the trial. As Jo mentioned, it doesn't, and Emily, it doesn't have to be rigid on a Friday. You know, we've got people that work a few hours on a Friday that I just heard about this week that I didn't even know were doing that. So people, I think, are so grateful they will do what they need to do to make it work. So yeah, I'd say give it a go and get all the learnings.
Okay, Nick, any final thoughts from you?
Just one, my takeaway, and I hadn't heard it before, was the gift of the fit. I'm going to borrow that, I think. I like that phrase.
Okay, well, thank you. That brings us to the end of today's discussion. If we didn't get to answer some of the questions that came in through our discussion, then we'll have a look at those and follow up with you. But I've really enjoyed the discussion and insights provided by all of our panelists today. So a huge thank you from us to all of them for sharing your time and your experience and wisdom. We'll be circulating a recording afterwards, so please feel free to contact us if you have any further questions. And thank you again for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.